Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Isfandir Batmagelic. Russia is one of the world's largest economies. It's a top energy exporter and a major supplier of wheat, fertilizers, wood, and metals. That means the way that Russia's economy responds to war and sanctions doesn't just matter for Moscow or Kyiv. It matters for the price of fuel in India, the cost of bread in Egypt, and the margins for factories in China. Since the invasion of Ukraine, Western governments have tried to squeeze Russia's revenues through unprecedented sanctions, price caps, and export controls. But the Russian economy has proved harder to read than many have expected. Understanding what's really going on in the Russian economy has become essential for anyone trying to design more painful sanctions or predict where global commodity prices are headed next. But what if our model of the Russian economy is fundamentally wrong? Nicholas Trickett is a political economist and writer who has spent years analyzing the Russian economy. When he's not working on his forthcoming book, Empire of Austerity, Nick is covering the global mining and metals industry as an associate director at S&P Global. Today, we will be discussing how economists have failed to understand the Russian economy, largely because they've ignored the importance of political economy. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into your book, I wanted to ask you to give us a snapshot of where the Russian economy is today. Actually, we're recording on the day when President Trump and President Putin are meant to have their much-awaited summit in Alaska. And we hear a lot of different takes about what's happening in the Russian economy. We hear that the sanctions are crushing the Russian economy. We also hear that Russia's actually booming because of the war and its response. What's the reality as you see it, and how should we be trying to measure, understand what's happening in Russia today?
So that's a very good question. I think what I tend to go back to Tom Waits' lyric, that someone makes money when there's blood in the street. The Russian economy at this point is kind of two parallel economies. You have the kind of civilian consumer economy that's more traditional, historically reliant on imports of various kinds, and then you have the war economies, which is grown massively in size, obviously, since 2022. I would say that the consumer economy at present is sort of like perched at the top of a hill and it's starting to accelerate downwards. So it's not yet in free fall. But I think there's an example of Elvira Nabiullina, who's the central bank governor, has compared Russia at multiple points in the last couple of years to a car and talking about the engine overheating from high inflation or whatever. I think that the current economy is, we essentially have these two economies in parallel with each other, and one, the war economy is trying to keep accelerating, and then the other half is trying to slow the car down, and they don't really know who's fully got the steering wheel or the accelerator, right? So, yes, I mean, there's lots of indicators that consumers are pulling back their spending. The rate at which Russians are taking money out of banks is rising. You have various light consumer industries going to 4-day weeks to kind of avoid layoffs, and not just like automaking or whatever. We're talking about like cement, stuff for construction. One of the biggest problems with this idea of the wartime boom for the average Russian becoming wealthier is that, based off what we can tell, because obviously official data has gotten increasingly squirrely and they hide more and more all the time, imports as a share of GDP didn't really grow. And it obviously shrank precipitously in relative terms in 2022, and it kind of recovered a bit in 23 and 24. But it's really difficult to believe that suddenly there was a spurt of investment into these consumer industries that hadn't received investment for more than a decade in some cases, in the span of a single year because of wartime spending. So I think that you still have evidence of attempts to increase output in the kind of military production side of things, even though that's peaked somewhat because of labor issues. And then on the civilian side of things are beginning to accelerate towards recession.
And so when we talk about the war economy, we're really talking about production that is devoted to the war effort. And so what you're describing is that, Russia, large consumer market, there is a significant amount of wealth in households in Russia, at least historically, that had been generated over time. And those households want to consume goods. And it used to be the case that, yes, a lot of those goods were being imported, but a lot of those goods were also being produced domestically. And so it seems like you're saying that the war economy is sort of cannibalizing from the production that would otherwise be supporting the consumer part of the economy.
Yes, with the one proviso that actually, at least up to COVID, so I think 2019 is the last time I saw this figure, something like 75% of the dollar value of the consumer basket was imported.
Wow. Okay.
So, there still obviously is like a Russian consumer industry of various kinds. And light vehicles have really suffered in the last couple of years, especially against Chinese imports. They're using effectively tariffs to deal with it. But I think that cannibalization and the point about wealth, the war economy is also beyond just the military production side of things. It's also an incredible wealth profusion into households because of the massive signing bonuses people have been getting. When you actually stack up the net benefits of the signing bonus, the pay itself is higher than the national average per month, and then your insurance and death and service benefits and so on. You're talking about somebody's life being worth more dead than working for 35 years at the national average income. So, you have seen this kind of explosion of spending power in some of the poorest of Russia's regions because people there have had the fewest opportunities economically. They joined the war effort. The problem is that local economies can't absorb that demand. And it's most evident in areas like housing. So the housing market was incredibly hot after 2020 because one of the COVID responses was to basically introduce subsidies for mortgages. They pulled that back last year. And because interest rates are so high, people have stopped buying homes, or new builds at least. But the point being that because of the mortgage subsidies during the war, as they continued, housing is less affordable today than it was in 2019. So even with these kind of massive increases in wages, people's ability to actually just secure property, which is one of the biggest investments people have been making for about 7 years now, it's suffered. And cars are also incredibly expensive compared to pre-invasion. And I think even if you go to the kind of other imported goods people still have access to via these various parallel import schemes, they're still probably 20 or 30% more expensive in price just because of the logistics costs and middlemen marking it up.
So essentially, the economists right now, when we're having a debate over is Russia's economy absorbing or the pain of the sanctions or being affected by the sanctions, I think what you're explaining is that actually we need to look at these parallel economies and understand that there is not, in this sense, one Russian economy. You now have a sort of bifurcation where there is an effort to develop this kind of war economy where production is focused for the war effort. There's a revaluing almost. I think this is really fascinating of like people's lives where, to the extent that conscription is allowing certain households to find this new spending power, there's a mismatch because at the end of the day, we don't see this attention towards the consumer economy. And that all sounds like a pretty messed up economic situation. And I guess one of the themes of your book project is to reframe how we understand the Russian economy and to explain that this isn't just a series of like unintended consequences, that actually what you're describing as these kind of perverse outcomes is in some ways the game plan. So this notion of empire of austerity emerges. What can you tell us about the way that the Kremlin is allocating resources to maintain control? I mean, how does the emergence of this kind of economic situation reflect a deliberate set of policies from the Kremlin?
So I think it's a mix. I think from the control side, it's very deliberate. Giving these massive bonuses out as a way to basically buy people's complicity with the war, right? I mean, the war itself is not necessarily popular, but people have a defensive reaction because they have to justify it to themselves, right? Given all the things that are happening, political speech has become increasingly restricted. You have people forcibly conscripted. There has been investment into the kind of security side domestically, but that's actually suffered somewhat since the invasion because of all the effort going towards the front. One example, this would have been true as of last fall, but as of last fall, something like 19% of all the kind of job openings for police officers were vacant nationally. So there actually is also issues about crime because one of the ways they've managed the kind of import effects of sanctions has been to essentially enlist organized crime into the process of actually feeding the war effort. So that's going to be really, really difficult to unwind, right? If there's ever any kind of end to this conflict. But the empire of austerity concept is really more that going back to 1998 when the country defaulted, there's been a consensus around what are effectively austerity politics. And if you look at the response to, for example, 2008, 2009, it was actually, despite it being large in GDP terms, something like 8-9% of GDP spent for a deficit. A lot of that deficit spending was just reserves of currency. And the actual country the economy ran a surplus in GDP terms of about almost 8% in the first half of 2008.
Driven by high commodities prices.
Yeah, oil prices, basically, yeah. And so the actual spending plans they launched were pretty miserly compared to what they could have done. In response to Crimea being annexed and the initial sanction shock and the oil market collapse, they obviously imposed austerity again, and spending decreased in nominal terms every year from 2016 to 2019, with inflation initially being high, it obviously collapsed eventually towards historic lows. Even COVID, the actual COVID response was smaller in GDP terms than 2008, 2009. And the current spurt of spending has always been, until this year, because of the oil price decline, it's been limited to deficits of roughly 2% of GDP, which is not like a massive spending spree, right? For an economy this size that has this capacity to tax, and tax capacity has improved in the last decade. So I think that the way that I think of it is more that from a disciplinary or control perspective, from what you're describing, precarity is easier for them to basically, force compliance on the public. Force the public to borrow out of their own pockets and pay, to pay the banks instead of the state helping them out. And then amongst the elites, obviously, it also kind of mediates competition because it creates a way that Putin can stage manage who gets what money.
How does that consensus emerge, though? Because, you talk about, obviously, this response to the financial crisis in 1998. On the other hand, given the kind of disposition that Putin and his political project has to kind of trying to reclaim some of the good old days of the Soviet Union, it seems counterintuitive that they would be very committed to sort of running their economy in a sort of austerity mindset and, trying to find surpluses and not spending so much on increasing welfare for ordinary people. Where does that ideological kind of approach come from? And, why do we have like Milton Friedman's dream kind of emerging in Putin's Russia?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think of it is that they're more Austrian than the Austrians.
Okay.
No, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, people have tried to blame the IMF. I don't think that's really fair. Though there certainly were IMF specialists who were involved in the story in the 90s. Really, what I think what it was a response to the default being so extreme because the ruble was basically worth about a sixth of what it had been before the default within like 5-6 weeks. So the response was so extreme, and the obvious need for order so widely understood that you had a center-right kind of consensus emerge. And the technocrats, who were more liberal economically speaking, they were kind of given the keys to figure out how to stabilize the economy and get things going. And that's where the kind of early reform plans that Putin put into effect as president in 2000, 2001, 2002 kind of come from. I mean, he himself, would speak about how we can't look like bankrupts in the eyes of the world. And there's definitely a very deeply felt fear of owing foreign creditors as a form of essentially national slavery. But they extend that, I would say, to domestic debt because they also don't want to owe anybody with in the country money because obviously that's leverage they have in the state.
Yeah.
So so you have that side of the ledger, and then you also have the early liberal technocrats, most famously Alexei Kudrin, who was the finance minister from 2000 to 2011. They did what they could to restrain spending in the early years because they were holding off the hardliners. And they didn't want the military to eat up all the money that was gained from stabilization. So you had this kind of bias towards quasi-austerity, if not formally austerity measures. But obviously, spending was growing because the oil prices kept rising. And I think there's also a broader misconception that the 2000s wasn't really an oil boom, even though it was obviously financed by oil. It was a consumption boom.
Yeah.
And that was because money was redistributed from the oil and gas sector. The problem being that by 2008, that model had exhausted itself as a source of growth. And so the next stage of growth had to essentially come from institutional reform, unlocking private investment, which wasn't possible given that the state now commanded the economy in terms of its largest institutions. Private investors were so reticent to spend that even in 2016, 2017, 2018, after Crimea, the Ministry of Finance tried to crowd in an infrastructure investment using basically public-private partnership models. And a lot of the deals they offered would have essentially returned 70 to 100% of the money you invested within a year, and still people didn't go for it. Which tells you people understood that owning those assets was risky because then you'd basically be politically complicit and had to be part of a kind of chain of command. So I think that the kind of austerity bias was hardwired during the boom years. It continues through the financial crisis because they see that crisis as somehow being about easy money and debt, which is, there's truth to it, but it doesn't really explain the crisis. And then they feel like they have to impose it because by 2011, they decide to undertake military modernization. And so everything has to go towards that because they've achieved financial sovereignty. So they've achieved their kind of core aims, initially stabilizing things. So from now on, everybody has to kind of suffer whatever comes.
So this austerity bias, I mean, we see it in the response to, we've talked about a few crises now, the 2008 financial crisis, the 2014 initial sanctions after the invasion of Crimea, 2020 with COVID. But of course, in 2022, you had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in response to that, the West applied broad sanctions. And what's striking is that pretty quickly after that initial sanctions move, I think partly because Western policymakers were so kind of forceful in their messaging around what the sanctions were going to do, you started to get a concern that the Russian economy was essentially shrugging off the sanctions pressure. So we've talked about this a little bit, but Russian policymakers basically began to run their economy hot. So going back to that metaphor of the car with the engine running really hot, defense spending surged. It seemed at least that wages were rising, particularly in areas where the industrial base was there and factories were trying to employ people as they boosted production. And therefore, unemployment started to come down, including because of the mobilization. So a lot of young men getting sent to the front lines. And this label emerged to describe the economic policy, military Keynesianism. And it caught on very quickly. And there was this idea that Russia had responded to the sanctions by using its war spending as a kind of stimulus, and this was helping the economy get out from the pressure of the sanctions. I mean, for me personally, kind of reading about this approach, I was really struck because I thought this was very different than how a lot of countries had responded to sanctions. One of the things in my own research looking at Iran was actually very similarly seeing this kind of strange commitment to austerity in the face of fiscal pressure, where actually government spending would be constrained and at the cost of the economy at large. It looked like Russia was doing something different, maybe smarter. Before we get into your critique, why do you think the framing emerged of this military Keynesianism, this war spending? Why do you think that became kind of the received wisdom about how Russia was shrugging off the sanctions?
Yeah, so I think, without naming names, because I don't think anybody's to blame per se for this, but I do think that there's a certain kind of part of the left commentariat on Russia that saw it as a useful framing because it basically was a justification for deficit spending that hadn't happened, right, ever before, kind of in the way that it was happening now. The best example I can think of in terms of how to think about the scale, if you actually add up the budgets from 2010 to 2021, and adjust for changes in the value of the ruble, et cetera, and just calculate how balanced was the budget in GDP terms, Russia only ran a deficit of about 0.5% of GDP over that time. And when you look at the war spending, so I think the basic attraction of it was that it helped legitimize this idea that the Russian economy is a Kalashnikov. That like it might be low tech, but it can shrug off various external constraints. And there's truth to that, obviously. A lot of why it shrugged it off were actually its institutional quirks and not necessarily signs of strength. For example, employers almost always throttle hours first. They don't do layoffs. So when you have a big external shock, there's like a long delay before the labor market really shows the scale of it, even though you might have withheld wages, for instance.
Because most of the data that's being collected is actually just this unemployment data, not like it's harder to get data on downtime at factories, for example. So you won't even see that this is happening. Exactly.
That and also wages have been suppressed by labor market practices in Russia for a long time. So, there's also this issue, right? So anyway, I think it took off because it was convenient. Like it was a useful prism at a time when no one had a good vocabulary or like a term to make sense of why the Russian economy seemed to be doing well, at least relatively speaking. I think going more towards my critique.
That's why you're here.
Yes.
Because, I wanted to hear this critical take.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest problems is the sanctions have been effective. They have done a lot of damage to the Russian economy. It's just that it's been indirect, and it has more to do with how those effects have been managed than the sanctions themselves. Because of the financial sanctions the U.S. imposed, the only way that Russia can get foreign currency into the country is to run a trade surplus at all times. And they obviously had reserves they were sitting on that weren't frozen in the West, fine. But the problem they had there is that if they're going to replace all these European imports with stuff from China, they have to run a bilateral trade surplus with China to get yuan, because Chinese banks are not going to extend lines of credit in yuan.
Yeah.
And that's really hard. And it effectively, if you'd seen lots of real wage growth, you would have actually seen that trade surplus evaporate.
Because there would be more demand for goods being imported from, let's say, China.
Yes. Yeah. Just in general, when you look at the aggregate figures on an annual basis that the central bank publishes, there wasn't really an increase, right? It was relatively constant. I mean, there was an increase, I think, in 23, but it's been relatively constant since then. So there's been some increase in imports, but not in the scale that you would expect, and it kind of matches the scale of what we think would happen because of a price adjustment from sanctions. So that's one part of it. Another part of it that I think is problematic as a framing is that because of that constraint, so because oil and gas have become even more important for the budget and for stability and for the ruble's value, the Ministry of Finance responded to the crisis by saying, okay, let's look for 10% cuts in discretionary spending. And they've been doing that since 2015. It's an almost annual exercise in the last decade. Not every single year, but most years, at some point in time, Anton Siluanov will go before the Duma and present a budget in which he talks about finding savings by doing that. So they were cutting spending on social stuff while they were still feeding money towards the war. So I think that, yeah, sure, there was deficit spending, but they were actually cutting spending on other needs. And the last leg of it, circling back to what I said about how they ran effectively a balanced budget over a decade, this war is the first fiscal stimulus the economy has actually received in terms of direct spending. Because in the past, most of the interventions have been tax breaks or kind of more indirect measures, occasionally, increasing pensions, whatever it is. This war is the largest fiscal stimulus in the last quarter century, after over a decade in which there wasn't any. So obviously the economy reacted suddenly vibrantly because all these businesses that have always been assuming that the worst is to come.
Yeah.
See money going out. And the actual secret to why it had such a rapid effect is that, in most years, and it's been normalized since then, but in most years, if you're contracted to provide something to the government or even to a state enterprise, because if you actually, state procurements from the federal government are only about 6-7% of GDP.
Mm-hmm.
If you include state companies, it's like 30%.
Okay.
And typically you can only get 30 to 50% of that contract as an advance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually why high interest rates have been a problem, because all these companies need working capital, so they're borrowing at higher rates at least. Anyway, in 2023, they suspended that rule and said you could pay effectively 90%, probably higher in some cases, in advance. So there was just a lot of money that hit the market very quickly.
Yeah.
And it had a catalytic effect, right? It lasted for a while, but that ceased to have any impact in a positive way on the civilian economy by, let's say, last spring.
And that's because even if, for example, there was more money kind of trickling down to households, whether through these businesses maybe hiring more, or whether through small businesses that were benefiting from procurement, or whether through families that had a son that was conscripted, at the end of the day, the economic pressure was still being pushed onto the consumer sector because prices were rising for everything, and there was nowhere to ultimately spend that money.
Yeah, or I think building on that, so why military Keynesianism is a problematic framing. It's if it really was a Keynesian economic logic, they would be expanding supply across the board.
There would be real growth. Right.
There would be an expansion of capacity to meet that demand, but there never was. And once you get to the war kind of reaching a very, very intense stages in 2023 with the counteroffensive and since then, you're talking about 30,000 people roughly conscripted every month and 30,000 people wounded or killed every month. So, it's not just that you have a kind of population that is competing over the goods that are available. You're also bleeding dry the actual labor force of working age men to do stuff that isn't for the war effort. Mm-hmm. And that matters, right? So I think that in that sense, I always saw it as parasitic as opposed to about expansion of capacities. And that basically that the expansion seen in 2023 and 2024 was kind of like a paradoxical short-term effect as opposed to an actual evidence that this was going to be a durable economic policy. And I think we've seen that this year. I mean, since really the spring, officials have been talking about, intentionally slowing down the economy because there's a price to pay for like all the war spending, and they're obviously saying it differently than that.
Yeah,
but they're very clearly communicating to people that their lives are getting worse and they better prepare for it.
Mm-hmm. But why? I mean, one of the themes in Empire of Austerity is that, and we've talked about this a little bit, is that we can talk about these things as a kind of a series of economic phenomena, things that are happening in the economy at a micro or macro level. But at the end of the day, what you're really telling is a story about, going back to the word that you used earlier, control. And so there seems to be this deliberate effort to make choices of economic policy that push economic hardship onto ordinary people and onto households, and that choice does something to change kind of the political economy in Russia and arguably strengthen the hand of the state. I mean, how do you see that process happening? And, what is it about Kremlin policymakers and their ability to undertake this process, especially since the war, but you've basically said this is something that's been happening since 1998, without facing a political price for it? Because at some point households will, surely they have realized that they are not in a better position. And in fact, to make this more concrete, I think there was news this week that the IMF, in its calculations of GDP per capita in the region, for the first time, Kazakhstan has overtaken Russia. So if you're a Russian household and you must sense that your welfare is stagnating, whereas even in other former Soviet republics, welfare continues to improve.
That's a good way of framing it. I think, so first off, I would say that it's important to distinguish the regime and the state. The regime's been strengthened by this process over time. The state has actually suffered from it.
Sure.
Not all aspects of the state. Tax capacity is better than it was, et cetera. But the capacity of the state to actually deliver economic reform was permanently kneecapped after 2008. And
social goods, presumably, like education and healthcare.
Yeah, obviously, there have been some things that have happened that might be positive locally. But for instance, during after 2012, when Putin returned to the presidency and he started instituting these so-called MAID decrees, of essentially just pretty targets that everybody else has to figure out how to get to. And then in 2012 and 2018, healthcare is part of it, and they wanted to raise the pay of doctors. So they fired doctors to raise other doctors' pay. So if you look at the actual availability of cots and so on, they fell. There are various ways. People working in hospitals started recording deaths by different metrics to hide how bad chronic conditions were, because that was a benchmark for them as a kind of KPI.
Mm-hmm.
The regime built a system in which people hide how bad things are as long as possible. So they can't hide it entirely, and there's a level of honesty, but that's like part of the process. I think. To your point about people not revolting, over these circumstances, or not protesting more, whatever it is, I think that there's been a really effective atomization of society socially in the last 15, 20 years. It started with TV stations in the 2000s. It eventually moved to the internet 10 years ago, and they obviously weren't as successful, controlling that space, but they still had an effect on it, and that's become more pronounced over time. And I think that for the average person, it's not really viable. Like the IMF saying that like Kazakhstan's richer than they are, they're not going to see that news. Not going to waste their time looking at it. And it goes even further, because if you think about the middle class as kind of the typical source of animus that changes political arrangements and social contracts, et cetera, the middle class was basically soaked by the regime after 2008, 2009, because they didn't spend money on a real stimulus, and they forced them to borrow money to keep their kind of quality of life. But what they did after Crimea successfully was to nationalize the middle class. And so they created their own financial equivalents to MasterCard, Visa, and all that. They created a much more robust mortgage market, because it really was very, very nascent. Until 2010, you could basically get your house for free if you were living in it from the Soviet period, for instance, right? So that worked very well. And also the state often pays better wages in the private sector. So you basically create these kind of financial incentives to not challenge authority. And that works really, really, really well.
This sounds very familiar to me from the case of Iran, because I think there's two aspects of it that strike me as similar. And in Russia, it's probably more pronounced, but one is if you basically put people in debt it significantly changes their willingness to absorb or like accept other kinds of risk. Like this notion that precarity may be incompatible with political mobilization by a middle class. I think that's something we've seen in a lot of countries, but it's interesting to hear that this may be part of the story in Russia. And the other example that seems similar with Iran is this notion that increasingly the middle class is dependent on civil sector jobs. And so you could have significant frustrations with the government, but still not feel comfortable taking an anti-system position because there is no alternate system that you can imagine. Because at the end of the day, there's no other job you could go for, and you're kind of stuck within an institutional framework that you're depending on.
Yeah, I think also, like, if you just look in percentage terms, not absolute terms, one of the best performing industries the last 10 years for employment has been insurance.
Interesting.
Which is never a positive indicator.
Yeah.
But I think also, if you think of it, since the war and sanctions kind of took effect in 22 at the current level, equally, if you're in the private sector, but you're making money off of the arbitrage from sanctions, because about 80% of all trade going into Russia now is basically managed through middlemen of various kinds, then like you want the war to continue, right? You don't want it to end. Mm-hmm. And so you get people to buy in that way. And I think that the nationals and patriotism stuff that people talk about from a kind of propaganda perspective is a bit exaggerated. Like, it's real, but I think that most of Russians' response tends to be defensive in nature. It's not that they're like proactively happy about killing Ukrainians. That's kind of an absurd position for me to take. There's some people who obviously feel that way. But I think that, the state has kind of weaponized precarity and also built a system in which people are dependent on their employers. Mm-hmm. And I think it's never been formally described by a regime official or state official, but I think that Igor Sechin, who's the head of Rosneft, back in 2010, Israelis then, he was already known as kind of the third man in government. He kind of had the idea, as described by economists from the time, like at Forbes and other business outlets, of basically a corporatist system. That you have these kind of big state or state adjacent companies that dominate any given sector, and then whenever there's a problem, you just go to them to fix it. Yeah, and so it's I think feudal is a little bit too strong, but it's essentially a kind of neo-feudal system, And so people have that kind of relationship with their employer, especially if they're living in a city or a town that's relatively reliant on heavy industry or kind of various sectors that depend on state orders. One of the best examples of a pressure point that is sanctions related, but not entirely due to sanctions. The coal industry is kind of facing collapse at the moment. The entire coal sector is no longer profit-making. And, that there are different reasons for that. China's invested in Mongolia. They can get discounts for Russian exports, et cetera. But the basic problem is that coal bulk carriers for rail wagons, they account for roughly 40% of the rail fleet. And if those orders dry up, then suddenly you have all these factory jobs that start falling apart. Yeah. And even those factories are having a hard time now sourcing enough ball bearings to kind of keep up. So there are these cascading effects that the sanctions have created, just that it takes a long time for them to kind of become more apparent. But I think that the system that's emerged in the last 15 years in Russia has been a kind of quasi-corporatist, state-dominated system where increasingly the regime has co-opted specific parts of state capacity to kind of achieve control or military ends, but not necessarily strengthen the state. Yeah, so this distinction between the regime and the state, I think that's something that probably should be an area for more intensive study when it comes to looking at how sanctions impact large economies. And for another episode of this season of the podcast, I spoke with Karam Shar, who's an economist focused on Syria. And we talk about the fact that up until basically December 2024, there was, I think, a growing sense that the sanctions had failed in the Syrian context because ultimately the Assad regime was able to make a series of decisions about its economic policy that allowed them to survive this pressure and prevail in the civil war. In the Syrian case, the example was, or one key example of this was that, the state quite early on during the civil war lost its oil revenues. But essentially, they had built a narco state through the export of a drug called Captagon, and that became a new source of revenue for the regime. And ultimately, though, one of the things that Karam and I were sort of discussing was on a long enough horizon, you can have sanctions that appear not to have much of an effect on the regime,
but have an effect on the state and the institutions of the state and the functions of the state. And I wonder to what extent you think that's what's happening in Russia, and also what that means for your assessment of the efficacy of the sanctions. Because at this moment, it doesn't look like the sanctions meaningfully prevented Russia from pursuing the war in Ukraine. It's very possible that Putin will emerge from the summit today with some kind of agreement from the US that he's going to keep some of the territory he has seized. But at the same time, if the goal of the sanctions was to weaken Russia in a broader sense, arguably weakening the state is a successful outcome. How do you sort of weigh between those two things?
Yeah, I think I'm somebody who is very dissatisfied with the economic blitzkrieg narrative of sanctions on Russia. Like I recall like Adam Tooze and other kind of commentators latching on it, which I understand. Like it made total sense at the time. I think that the sanctions have actually been relatively effective. The problem is that the things they've had an effect on could never actually stop the war from happening. Mm-hmm. So to your point, though, to talking more about the kind of state regime distinction, for instance, that trend predated even Crimea. But
sure.
That really began by 2008. But I think sanctions accelerated that process, but I don't think it started it. But like because of this constraint on the need to run this trade surplus and the way in which you have to manage the state's finances to kind of get over the shock, I would say that they actually made it really difficult to mobilize society fully. And some of that was also just self-inflicted, but sanctions made that worse. And so even though Russia's been able to pursue a fairly intense war of aggression at a relatively high intensity in like the largest land conflict, in a half century more in Europe, I would say that they've actually been constrained in their ability to mobilize it fully. So even now, when it kind of has become a war economy, they never fully mobilized. And there are issues with recruitment, and they had to use economic incentives to get people to die because they couldn't just force people off factory floors or whatever to go. They never could. They still can't. So there's very clearly like a sensitivity and some kind of internal constraint on what they're willing to pursue. And things are getting much worse amongst the elite. Mm-hmm. Most infamously, over the summer, there was one, minister who had been kicked out of the post, but basically he was about to go down for corruption and bring down people with him. So he committed suicide instead of going through with the actual trial. And that has been a crystallizing moment within I think, the elite right now during the war, because it's made it very clear that loyalty is not enough. It used to be that being loyal to Putin was some degree of protection, and that's evaporated the last 5 years. And so now there's no real stopping like this train, to use the Breaking Bad kind of logic, right? That the war has taken on a life of its own within the regime. And no one can really challenge or get rid of Putin directly, but people are going to start getting more and more creative, pursuing what they want under the cover of that initiative as like kind of the highest aim of the state or the highest aim of the country. So I tend to think that sanctions have been effective at weakening Russia's capacity to wage war, just not enough to meaningfully stop like a massive land conflict, because they can do that with relatively uncomplex weapons.
So if you're looking at these big political economy effects, it might be that for a US or European policymaker, I imagine your conclusion there would be very reassuring. Like, actually, here's a strong argument for the sanctions working. But on the other hand, one of the questions is, how do we get out of this very difficult situation where you have a particular political project in Russia, one of the largest, most influential countries in the world, that is not only very corrosive domestically, because we have this now long-running pattern, maybe accelerated by sanctions, whereby the regime is hollowing out the state, is putting pressure on ordinary people, and creating these really sort of perverse situations where it's very difficult to even imagine a kind of middle-class political renewal in Russia. And then, of course, that kind of country tends to externalize a lot of negative outcomes for other countries. And, Ukraine, maybe the war will end at some point, but at the end of the day, you have a Russia that has been kind of forged in a certain environment and is committed to a certain way of kind of conducting itself in the global system. where does that sort of lead us in terms of the outlook for the future? Because, we can potentially use sanctions to try and limit capacity of this country. But if there are these underlying forces that the sanctions don't actually interfere with, but maybe even accelerate, that make Russia a more problematic or dangerous country because of the nature of its political economy, that seems to me to be a very dangerous outcome.
Yeah. So I guess what you're also asking kind of implicitly is like, what would I have done?
Yeah,
going back to 2022.
By all means.
Yeah, so I think the basic problem with sanctions obviously was always in isolation. They were never going to work as a kind of cure-all, right? The easiest fix is to make sure that the oil market's flooded with supply. So had they actually successfully re-entered the JCPOA in 2022, they lifted sanctions on Venezuela and passed the Inflation Reduction Act partially as a means of minimizing consumption and accelerating the demand destruction, which China's kind of been responsible for now. That would have been a combination of a strategy that would have made it incredibly difficult for the regime to actually punish the population even more, because there is a material constraint of some kind based off their own decisions. Obviously, it's not a massive one, but it's there. It also would have made deficit spending even more inflationary, because based off an analysis from Sberbank, so the biggest state-owned bank in the country, every roughly percentage point of GDP of deficit spending that takes place since 2022, 2023, it creates about 4% inflation. So it's very, very quickly ratchets beyond the 4% inflation target that they set for themselves as stability and so on. So that's an example, right? So I think for me, that was my kind of horror in 22 and 23, was seeing that there was a failure to understand energy policy in the United States in terms of clean tech as a national security imperative, and an unwillingness to change sanctions policies with other countries that would have actually made it materially easier to.
This is a slightly different conversation, but it occurs to me that part of the issue here is that the U.S. now sees itself as a major oil producer. And so there's a strong political constituency that is opposed to the idea of lower oil prices and supply being flooded, especially given the break-even oil price for U.S. oil producers versus other countries.
Yes, though they've become much more efficient in the last couple of years. So I think, granted, they didn't expect the kind of situation to go the way it has under Trump this year, for instance. But I think that you can probably push past that political constraint relatively easily, given how many other constituencies there are that consume the products, right? I think that it's more a matter of how we talk about energy in terms of national security. And that's obviously right now we're talking about AI and other stuff like that. But I think that that's the biggest failing of the sanctions package on Russia, is that there was a failure to integrate Russia's reliance into a larger economic strategy that wasn't just punishment.
But also, some of the actions you just described would have represented major sanctions lifting on other quote unquote U.S. adversaries. So that's a political hurdle that is very difficult to cross. So that maybe indicates that at some point you get diminishing returns because you start to get constrained by your sanctions programs in other places if you want to pursue a certain approach with Russia.
Yeah, the unfortunate reality of commodities is that they're geographically bound. You can't really have geopolitical cakeism when it comes to a market where relatively marginal changes in the supply-demand balance can have a large effect on prices.
Yeah. So, Nick, I want to just sort of wrap up the conversation by asking you to look forward a little bit. In the book draft that I've read, which is excellent, you talk about this idea that there's structural exhaustion in the Russian economy, that at some point two parallel economies, the war economy and the consumer economy, they can't keep driving in opposite directions. It's going to pull the system apart. Your book is not out yet, and there's always a peril when you're writing a book because you're predicting into the future. Also, things may happen between now and when the book comes out, hopefully the beginning of next year. If you have to look forward a little bit and you think about this interaction between this really deep commitment to an austerity approach to Russian economic policymaking and the continued kind of pressure or intervention that's represented by the sanctions, which, if the summit fails today, could intensify potentially. The Trump administration has talked about that. Where do you see things heading? We might end up in a situation where the Russian economy starts to really falter At what point does that become a problem for the regime? We know it's a problem for ordinary people. We know it's a problem for the state, but what about for the regime?
I think it's become one already. I mean, obviously it doesn't mean that it's existential, but the escalation of attacks on Ukrainian civilians, to me, was actually evidence of desperation in the sense that they really need to compel some kind of progress by the end of summer, because without it, things are getting more difficult enough across the wider economy that they have to, scale back or change their approach a bit. And they obviously have capacity to adapt, so I don't want to say that it's static, but I think that they're already under pressure. Projecting forward, I think it depends on what timescale you're talking about. If it's the next 6 months, I think there'll be a recession probably next year, or otherwise GDP will be zero. Like it'll just kind of be literally flatline.
Yeah.
But living standards will get worse. On a longer time horizon, though, like they're in massive trouble because they snuff out innovation. It's really hard to innovate in that economy. And their biggest trade partner, who's keeping them afloat, is building a future in which you don't need oil to power vehicles.
Yeah.
And that's just a fundamental challenge that they can't escape. I mean, the Asia Pacific was supposed to be their salvation for demand back in 2014, 2015. And it's the Asia Pacific that's getting rid of demand fastest, structurally. I mean, Europe obviously is still also buying EVs. And I think that the narrative of like a kind of slowdown in EV sales is a bit exaggerated globally. It's mostly a US story.
Yeah.
But to me, that it's the biggest irony of Russian foreign policy that they failed to foresee that perhaps their most important kind of partner in this was actively building a world in which they were kind of redundant.
I'm sure Chinese policymakers want to reduce their dependence on Russia, knowing particularly, I suspect that they have a fairly sophisticated understanding of how these political economy questions are evolving. Nick, we've reached the end of our time, which means I have to ask you the final question I ask every guest on the show. When did you realize that sanctions are changing the world?
Probably 2018, 2019.
Okay.
And that's from an energy market perspective, because I mean, they hadn't fully set in, because I think that post-COVID, it kind of became more intense, obviously. But once it became clear to me that sanctions were actually a tool of oil market management, whether the enforcement, non-enforcement, applying them or not, to me, that was a fundamentally different environment than like the one that I went to college in. Where there was, I mean, obviously I went to college right when the JCPOA was first being negotiated, when they had this intensification of Iranian sanctions to try to compel them to negotiate. But I think that it became a structural feature probably sometime around 10 years ago, or, maybe a little bit less in terms of my consciousness, that we are now in a world in which, restricting access was going to be a kind of key determinant of geopolitical outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And actually, in the first episode of this season, when I spoke to Eddie Fishman, he made a similar point about that under Obama, which is exactly when you and I were in college, basically, there was a view that the sanctions were an unnatural state and that at some point they would be lifted. Somewhere during Trump's first term, it became pretty clear that they're actually a structural feature of the global economy. And maybe there'll be changes in enforcement posture, but for the most part, you're going to keep the sanctions in place as a lever to manage these markets and add pressure here and there.
Yeah, I guess the last thing just to add to that is that to me, it's a symbol of the American problem of kind of main character syndrome. And it's not that the US is not dominant in many respects, but like, especially when it comes to like the energy world, I mean, it's absurd to suggest that energy dominance in the United States is real. It isn't from strictly speaking an oil and gas extraction perspective and sales perspective, but the vast majority of capacity being installed globally is solar PVs, batteries, wind power, things that are made by Chinese companies, and Chinese mining and metals companies dominate that world.
Yeah,
and so I think that there's also a kind of an attempt to retrench or to retain past glory by using the sanctions as opposed to a proactive vision for what they could actually do.
One thing Trump and Putin might have in common is an obsession with past glory. Nick, thanks for taking the time to come onto the show, and good luck with the final edits on the book.
Thank you again for having me.
I'm Esfandyar Batmanghelidj, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions. Thanks for listening.